Thank you, Professor Bostrom, for taking the time to talk with me briefly.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we could organize something.
Yeah, I think your work has impacted a lot of my thinking, and I've been doing this show for the last 5 years, and particularly your book, Superintelligence and the Simulation Hypothesis paper has been discussed a lot on this show. So I think even our listeners know your work. So thank you for taking the time.
I'm glad that there is interest. Let me get a little bit of coffee going here.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah, it's an honor to talk to you about your new book, Deep Utopia: Life and Meaning in a Solved World. I'm currently reading it on Kindle, and I enjoy it a lot. I enjoy your writing and thinking, and I'm impressed with every page. So thank you for writing it.
That's very kind.
Yeah. So can we maybe start with defining some terms from the title? I would be interested in you explaining what you mean by the term utopia. I know it's a common term, but I think it would be great to be clear before we start. What does utopia look like in your view, and maybe how it differs from other views of this term throughout history?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a broad concept that people use in different ways. Maybe people are more familiar with dystopia almost. Like there are a lot of works of fiction that people will have heard of, 1984, Brave New World, Handmaid's Tale, etc., that depict kind of future societies where things are much worse in some ways. And utopia would be the converse, like what could we imagine that would be a much better world? But it's actually harder to write a utopia. I mean, most people might be hard pressed to name a single one. And if you look at the literature of attempts that have been made, they are usually not actually very successful. Like most of the utopias that have been presented are not actually places you would want to spend the rest of your life.
Yeah.
But anyway, there is this, and usually it's kind of focused on politics and culture. How can we organize the economics of a society so that everybody has what they need and that there is no unfairness, etc. But in my book, I want to sort of focus more on the underlying deeper philosophical value questions of what makes a life good. And in particular, if we abstract from all the kind of practical constraints that currently limit what is possible, and imagine a world that has reached technological maturity. So we have like super advanced technologies, and let's assume somehow the governance aspects work out as well as they can work out. So there's not like some horrible totalitarian, oppressive, like imagine that's being as nice as it can. Like, so then a lot of our problems would be solved in this kind of world. And in fact, so many problems will be solved that you start to have to worry about purpose and meaning, these values that seem important to us humans. Like we want to feel that we are contributing to the world, that we are needed. But in what I call the solved world, that comes into question.
Mm-hmm. Probabilistically, what would you say is our chance in still finding meaning in this solved world or utopia?
Well, I would preface my answer by saying that I think meaning is not maybe the most important value. There, I think many things that can add desirability to a human life, from very sort of concrete values like pleasure and like actually enjoying your existence, I think is like really important. But it's kind of like theoretically less interesting to spend a lot of because you could say that point. And obviously at technological maturity, people would have the abilities to exert fine-grained control over their psychological states through, you know, some sort of super drugs without side effects, or more direct neural implants, or reorganization of human brains, or digital brains that may and then there's like a whole bunch of other values also that we'd say, so if you value knowledge or understanding, or like these things also would be easy to instantiate in a solid world. So we then focus in on the narrower set of values that actually seem like potentially to be harder to instantiate in this condition of a solid world, maybe even impossible. So meaning and purpose would be amongst them. I'm ultimately fairly optimistic that at least various forms of purpose would be possible. So you could sort of add those to all the other good things about lives. Meaning is a little bit more iffy, shall we say. But, you know, then again, it's not even clear to everybody whether our current lives have meanings. I mean, that's something that people have been wrestling with and searching for.
It's subjective, no?
So subjective means, so this is important. Yeah. So we need to make a distinction here. The subjective sense of being filled with a sense of purpose and direction, and like being motivated to pursue something, like, so that clearly would be possible in deep utopia, right? Because those are psychological states. We would have unprecedented control over psychological states. So certainly if you want to just feel subjective purpose, that, yeah, we can check that box. The utopians could have massive amounts of motivation. But some people think that in addition to that, there is some value in having sort of objective purpose. That is not just you feel motivated, but there is something you actually need to do that is like objectively worthwhile you're doing it. And so in today's world, if we're looking around, there are a lot of plausible things that need doing. Like you could, you know, in your own life, you know, there's a bunch of stuff you have to do. Maybe you have to, you know, go into the office to get a paycheck so you can pay your bills. So you have to drive your kids to school. You have to brush your teeth. Like there's like a bunch of stuff. And if you don't do them, it has real negative consequences. And in the larger world, of course, there's huge amounts of need, a lot of suffering. You could try to improve your local society, your friends, or in the wider world, there's just massive like demands on human agency. So one thing that we do have a lot of currently is like opportunities for purposeful activity. But if the world was solved, like if the world was already as good as it could be, or if whatever remaining tasks needed to be done, it could be much better done by machines, in like AIs and in like robots, then it's much less clear that we would be able to have that sense of objective purpose. That just wouldn't be, you know, at least at first sight, anything that we could do that would actually we would need to do.
I'm particularly interested in what you said about things that you need to do, like, and then you basically painted this as an objective thing. But I cannot see the link. I still see it as subjective. It's my opinion that I have to go to work, but I don't have to go to work in the objective world. I could not go to work, right?
Yeah. So you could, even if you're a subjectivist about values, let's say, you could say that there is a sense in which you have an objective need to get to work in as much as otherwise there are real consequences for you if you don't get to work. Things will happen to you that in fact you don't like. You will eventually get thrown out of your apartment if you can't pay the bill. And so, and you in fact have a desire not to be homeless, let us say, or not to be able to feed your family, or like there's a bunch. So the only way you can get what you want currently is by exerting effort. Time and energy and striving to achieve various things. So in that sense, there's like objective purpose. I mean, you could like, there are different, like there's like aims, like if you want to get food, you have to go to the fridge and open the fridge door, like on a small scale. And then you have sort of larger scale efforts where maybe you need to study hard for several years to get your degree so you can get the career you want, etc. And so our current lives are sort of full of these purposes at various levels, instrumental necessities where you have to invest effort in order to get the outcomes that you happen to desire. But at technological maturity, for at least a lot of different desires you might have, there would be no need for you yourself to make an effort to achieve them, because to the extent that they can be achieved, it would be more efficient to ask your robot butler to do them. This might be most obvious with respect to, say, economic tasks. So right now we have to work because there's a lot of, we need products and services in the world, right? But if we could automate all of that, which we might well, in some number of years, if the whole AI revolution succeeds, we would enter a post-work condition where there would be, to a first approximation, no more need for human economic labor. So that's like sort of one layer of the onion. We wouldn't have to work for a living. So, okay, so that would require some rethink, but it's not that radical, because there are a lot of current humans who don't have to work for a living, right? You're independently wealthy, or you're a child, or you're retired. There are various categories of people, and they still often have full days and like a lot of things they are doing, right? Like, because there are other things they want to achieve that you can't achieve by just paying money for it. So if Bill Gates wants to be fit, he has to actually drag himself to the gym and work out. He can't hire somebody else to do that on his behalf. But we then get to the slightly more radical conception, not just of a sort of post-work or post-scarcity condition, but of I call it the plastic world, where we ourselves also become malleable. And so at technological maturity, you could pop a pill that would induce the same physiological effects in your body as maintaining an active exercise schedule. And you can sort of go through the different activities that currently fill our lives, and one by one kind of cross them out. That would be a shortcut at technological maturity to the same outcome, which wouldn't require, it seems, investment of our own effort. So there's that sense in which, the purpose that we currently fill our lives with would disappear in this condition of a solved world.
Do you think this condition presupposes or needs? Basically, do I need to remove the information that I solved my problem with a shortcut? And I want to connect this with your simulation hypothesis. I was always thinking that it needs to be connected with a solved world, because I need to feel meaning, I need to feel purpose in my life, and then I go into the simulation experiment or the simulation itself, and then I erase my memory, and I still feel the problems. Do you think these two are connected? Because you use the term pill, but this could be a simulation itself.
Yeah. I think like in the longer run, like operating human minds by running them on biology seems quite inefficient. You could do that. You could have like really fancy biotechnology and medicine to keep people healthy and alive, but probably it would be more efficient to sort of upload human minds into, but be that as it may. So one way theoretically you could reintroduce purpose in a solved world would be by placing yourselves in positions where you don't have all the affordances of technological maturity. It's a little bit like now, sometimes people go off the grid out into the wilderness, and maybe they even leave their cell phone behind. So like once they're out there, they have no option. If they want to survive, like they have to build shelter, and they have to, eventually, maybe gather some food. And that's like, you can sort of deliberately like find a location where you don't have all the affordances of modern civilization in order, if you want to experience that challenge, and if you want to be in a situation where you really have to rely on your own survival skills. And so analogously, you could, in a solved world, create a little pocket of instrumental need and necessity, or, more thoroughly, like enter some simulated environment where you don't. But I think that there would be other ways that you could have, certainly you could have artificial purposes in a solved world, where you basically set yourself some goal, could be arbitrary goal, and then once you have that goal, if it's a suitable kind of goal, it would require your own effort to achieve it. So we see that today with games, and sport. Like, say, somebody plays golf. So they set themselves the kind of rather arbitrary goal of getting a little ball into a sequence of holes. Not just that, but part of the goal is that you're supposed to accomplish this objective using only a small set of permitted means. Like, particularly, you're allowed to hit the ball with a club. But you can't. What would be much more efficient would be just to pick the golf ball up and play. But so part of the goal is that you're supposed to achieve a certain objective using only a certain set of permissible means. So if you do accept that as your goal, then at that point, the only way you can achieve it is by playing golf or actually exerting yourself. And so similarly, in a solved world, you could set yourself goals that where part of the goal is that you only are allowed to use certain means, like maybe relying on your own efforts. And so if you allow that kind of artificial purpose, certainly the utopians could have that. They could maybe fill their days with all kinds of sophisticated forms of game playing, invent new kinds of games, individual games or social games, and then that restrict the allowable means, and they could kind of create opportunities for purposeful activity in that way. So these would be artificial goals in the sense that they are sort of made up, like it's like they're based on arbitrary goals that you could set yourself. So it's interesting to ask if you can could you also have natural goals in a solved world, like ones where the objective is not arbitrary? And I think there could be some opportunities for that as well, depending on what your values are. But for example, if you value honoring certain traditions, then it might be that the only way for you to actually achieve your goal of honoring a tradition is by yourself doing certain things in the traditional way. Or if you have two people, A and B, and A happens to want that B gets what it wants. So A cares about B and wants them to get, and then B has this opportunity to give the gift of purpose to A, because if B then wants A to do certain things themselves, as opposed to sort of outsource it to machine, then now A is in a situation where the only way that A can get what it wants, which is to satisfy B's preferences, is by actually doing these things themselves. And so then, A is in this situation where actually their own efforts are needed, where they do have natural purpose from these sort of social cultural entanglements. And I think this is kind of, in the case of A and B, it's a bit hokey, but you could imagine more sort of subtle ways of the same thing, where you have communities with certain practices. And so I think there could be sort of forms of natural purposes that could survive this transition to a solved world. Maybe there would be less strong and compelling purposes than the ones that we have available today, like where there are like literally starving children and people dying from diseases and all kinds of like screaming moral imperatives that place demands on us. But if all these urgent, like desperate needs were taken care of, then it might be sense to sort of recalibrate ourselves to be more compelled by smaller reasons. Just as at night, like our pupils dilate, so we can, because it's like there's less light around, so it makes sense for you to take in more of the light. Then you can see the constellations in this in the starry sky, right? That they were there all along, even during the daytime. They were there. You just couldn't see them because the sun just was so bright that you couldn't. So similarly, I think there might be these subtler values that we are oblivious to now. Because there are so many more pressing demands on us. But if all of that was taken care of, then it might make sense to become more sensitized to these like weaker reasons for doing things.
Yeah, connected to simulation hypothesis. So probabilistically, you probably believe that we are already living in a simulated environment or a simulation per se. So that would mean, would it be true to say that we already did solve the world in reality -1?
Well, somebody did in that scenario, right? So, I mean, and it's true that I speak of a solved world, but it's a little bit, a world here doesn't necessarily mean the totality of physical existence. It's more a world in the colloquial sense. So you could have, I mean, maybe there's like some extraterrestrial planet far away in Alpha Centauri where they have sort of reach technological maturity and then are enjoying utopia. So maybe their world would be solved. Whereas it seems that our current world that we inhabit is not solved, in as much as there are a lot of horrible things going on, and we certainly need to do a lot of things to stave off misfortune. So at least experientially, from our perspective, it seems we are not inhabiting a sort of solved life world.
But that could be the code of the simulation, right?
Right.
That could be the code that it's not solved. So
yeah, I mean, it might be. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's solved at the simulators level. If we are in a simulation, maybe they have solved their world and then created this simulation within which there are creatures who are sort of occupying a not yet solved world.
What value does personally bring this simulation hypothesis maybe to your life or everyday life? Do you think about it often or not?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think of it as like an important constraint, as it were, on what you can coherently believe about the overall structure of reality and your place within it. So if one is thinking about, as I often do, about the future of AI or existential, what we sort of have most reason to do at the macro strategic level, then it certainly seems to be a very important factor in that picture. The precise implications are a little unclear, but it seems very likely that it has some implications. Like it's like kind of an elephant in the room in some sense. So it might be that there are certain insights that on their own don't tell you much about how to live your life, but they are plausibly such that if you combine them with a couple of other things, the sort of the conjunction of those, several things might have striking implications. And I think it is a little bit like that, except perhaps we're still missing, one or more of the other relevant insights that would combine with the simulation argument to tell us what to do.
Yeah. So this future utopian world that you often describe seems to imply a set of universal values. Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily. I think you could read it as an investigation into our human values, or even just some subset of human, even if it's just like my values. I mean, it's up to the reader, really. It's like less a book of conclusions and claims and more a book about questions that tries to enable the reader to bring certain questions into focus so that they can, think about them and make up their own minds. Mm-hmm. They kind of, all like a reason for writing the book ultimately is that I'm figuring that perhaps at some point somebody needs to deliberate about what we want from the future. And it's a really hard question because the future could be quite different from the present. There's like such a much bigger space of possibilities where you could imagine human nature itself being something you can change. And so it's a hard process, like whether that's like some guy in an AI lab has to decide this, or a nation, or maybe some humanity-wide deliberative process, somebody at some point. And so it would seem useful if there were like some kind of reading material that they could look at in advance of entering into this deliberation process that would like equip them with relevant concepts and considerations, and also put them in the right frame of mind to approach these questions, which I think is maybe just as important, because it might well be that the outcome of the deliberation depends on exactly how you go about it. And so having a kind of generous, open-minded, slightly playful, thoughtful approach to these questions, I think makes it more likely that the outcome would be good than if you were going into trying to answer the same question, but like in a different frame of mind. So that's part of what the book is also trying to do, which is one of the reasons why it's written, not as a sort of a purely philosophical disquisition, but why it has these literary elements as well. There are like certain things that are hard to say, but that maybe you can show in the playful interactions between the different characters and the general spirit that I'm hoping comes through, as it were, between the lines.
Yeah. So how would you say that we can navigate between or potential conflicts between different values or cultural values even in this pursuit? Now we are building AI, somebody's training it, applying weights. What happened in the Google with the Gemini image creation tool. So how do you see? So how could we navigate defining what our human values are, as you said? Who's going to define it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think at a more practical level, I think there needs to be some framework or process for integrating different preferences and different interests to try to find cooperative outcomes that can accommodate many different values and interests and stakeholders. And I think that's really important. Like maybe the most important factor as to whether the future goes poorly or badly is the question of what degree we manage to do this in a cooperative spirit. Because the future could be very big and there would be plenty for many different value systems to achieve. Maybe not all of what they want, but like you could give most value systems kind of 95% of what they want. And so that, I think, it will be a very important and difficult thing to navigate. But I'm mostly setting that aside in this book to sort of focus more, not just kind of some framework for finding some compromise where different people's values can, or some like democratic solution or bargaining system. But like at some point, people individually will also need to decide what are actually their own values. Like maybe they don't need to compromise with other values, but somebody actually needs to answer the sort of object level question at some point. And so that's what the book is trying to look into. You could also view it like so there might be some people who think this is all nonsense about future AIs and stuff, and like, and I think even for those people, you could view it as a kind of philosophical particle accelerator, like where you sort of consider your values by looking at this set of extreme conditions, like a solid world, super advanced technology, all kinds of other, and then you sort of smash the values together, like the physicists smash particles together at extreme energies to sort of then see what their basic constituents are. And then the idea is that, well, the same constituents might be present in ordinary matter. It's as like, but now we can sort of understand it. And then similarly, maybe our values that we have in ordinary lives are sometimes hidden from us because they are sort of clouded by all the practical considerations. But like by looking at how they would like combine or conflict under these extreme conditions, we might get a clearer view of what the basic components of our values are. And then we can learn something from that about the values as they apply in ordinary life as well. So you could just read it as a sort of straightforward, like philosophical investigation into human purpose and meaning and values. For me, there is this kind of ulterior motive of thinking that there is actually a real possibility we might have to answer these questions in a sort of a practical sense.
Yeah. On the topic of AGI, there are different definitions of AGI. What do you see? What would qualify as an AGI in your view? And do you think pursuing AGI is good?
Yeah. So AGI, artificial general intelligence, roughly speaking, is, I guess, an AI that can do basically everything that the human mind can do. Now, when we were far away from AGI, this was maybe sufficiently precise. Now, as we move closer, we can see that this is actually not a point, but like a kind of multidimensional cluster of different things. And it might now be necessary to try to use more precise concepts. Because as you move closer, what looks like a point from a distance actually might have more structure and have dimensions, right? And so now you might think of, well, how far are we from, say, having the ability to create a drop-in worker who could do everything that a human teleworker could do, like a remote worker, like a competent human remote worker, and then you could differentiate between different levels of remote worker, like somebody with a basic high school education, somebody who's like a really skilled graduate. And so you could sort of, because we are now moving so close that these distinctions actually become relevant. I would say the main thing that is maybe currently missing is the ability for long-range agency and planning. So the LLMs are really good at doing the things that we can do in a one shot, like in a minute or something like that. Like you could answer some question, put out a paragraph of text, but you could also ask a human to pursue some project, maybe over the course of a few months. And this is like the kind of frontier of AI currently, where the people are working on this. But right now, there's like a kind of deficit in being able to pursue long-term goals, taking a bunch of sequential actions independently and monitoring your own result and course correcting. But if we get that, then it really does look like we have some form of AGI.
Yeah, I think this is inevitable, but do you think it's good, like in a broad sense of the word, good?
Yeah, I do think I see, and I think from AGI then we will have superintelligence. I think, and I think that superintelligence is this sort of a portal through which humanity will, at one point or another, need to passage, and that like the path to really great futures ultimately go through this portal of developing machine superintelligence. But that there will be significant risks, including existential risks, associated with this transition to the machine intelligence era, and that it would seem desirable to have the option of going a little bit slow in the critical stages of this transition, rather than like as soon as you figure out how to do it, you have to immediately crank all the knobs up to 11, because there are like 15 other competitors breathing down your neck, and if you take any precautions whatsoever, you just immediately fall behind, and the race goes to the most reckless. That seems like a risk-increasing setup. So you would want maybe the ability to slow down for 6 months or a year or 2 years. But ultimately...
That's realistic in a profit-seeking world?
Well, there's a question of how much exactly. I mean, I'm sure they'll probably have like at least a week they could slow down. Like whether they will have a year is more questionable. Whether 2 years, so this like it's not an all or nothing thing. I certainly think there currently are strong competitive dynamics at play. And it's like a complex space there, exactly what one would want to push for in the policy space, and to what degree, say, various forms of coordination between leading AI labs or government involvement would make things better or worse. And it depends a lot on the specifics, I think. But I do think ultimately it would be an existential catastrophe in its own right if we never developed superintelligence. First of all, we'll probably destroy the world in some other way if we don't roll the dice at some point with superintelligence. And so with that, I would kind of be sad as well if we didn't even get to try this. But even setting that aside, I think the human game, we've been at it now for 100,000, 200,000 years. Okay, so maybe that we could do a bit more. But at some point, if millions of years from now, it's the idea that there are these bipeds running around and doing their sort of living for 70 years and doing their, at some point, it feels like maybe it would be good to unlock the next level. Because there's just so much more that like in the space of possible modes of being, so much higher levels of happiness and insight and understanding and love and like creativity that I think are possible, but that are not possible with our current biological brains. And that at some point, I think it would be good if we could unlock. And there are some additional considerations as well, but they are like more esoteric, perhaps.
How is intelligence, in your view, connected to consciousness? Because in your writing, I think in the simulation hypothesis, you mention that simulated people could be conscious, right? If the simulations are sufficiently fine-grained, right?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on this connection?
Well, so I believe in the sort of a substrate independence thesis, which is that mental states, subjective experiences could, in principle, be implemented not just by organic brains, but by, say, silicon computational systems. I think basically it's a computationalist perspective that what makes a certain physical system have conscious experiences is not which atoms it is made up of, whether it's carbon atoms or silicon atoms, but it's the structure of the computation that it implements. So our brains implement a certain form of computation, and if those were implemented in, say, a silicon-based computer, then that silicon-based computer would have associated with it conscious experience as well.
Why do you have this view that consciousness happens through complex computation, if I understand you correctly?
Yeah, well, so it's a fairly widespread view, I think, amongst cognitive science philosophers, neuroscientists. And there are different ways of maybe making it plausible. So you could consider a scenario where you have a gradual replacement of the neurons. If you start with a biological human brain like yours, and then suppose you replaced one neuron with a kind of a silicon chip that had exactly the same input-output function. So it would receive signals from your other neurons and then do whatever your neuron did and like output the same signals so you wouldn't notice any difference. Like you would still behave the same. Yeah. And presumably your conscious experiences would be unchanged. And then you could imagine replacing another one. And at some point you're entirely silicon. And if you thought that there would be a difference in the conscious experiences between sort of the system you had at the beginning, fully organic, and the system at the end, then like there would at some point need to be a transition where like either your conscious experiences disappeared. But you wouldn't be able to report on this. Your behavior wouldn't change. If you asked yourself during this process, you would like be asserting confidently, no, it feels exactly the same as before. Yeah. This is good. Yeah, I still feel pain. I still see like tomatoes as red. Yeah, just keep replacing the neurons. Yeah. And so it would sort of be a weird override of the direct subjective reports of the subject in question to like postulate that there were like a radical shift in the mental experiences associated with the system. So that's like one type of philosophical argument. You might also be able to run some argument as to what the meaning of the words are if they can't affect what somebody's like dispositions to think or report. It is unclear even what maybe it would mean to whether the hypothesis is even meaningful in a deep sense. That is another way you could sort of, if depending on your theory of meaning, it might be that meaning is kind of connected to different ways in which you're able to respond differently depending on which different beliefs you accept. And if there were no possible like behavioral output that would differ, then it's not clear that the distinction would be really meaningful. That then relies on various theories of meaning, which philosophers disagree with. But I think this gradual replacement scenario maybe for some people would be sufficient to motivate the thought.
Yeah. So
I mean, I would go further. Say, I mean, you could also say the simulation argument itself, right? Is I mean, it kind of is. I mean, I think it's not just possible that silicon systems could be conscious, but that we might well be silicon systems or whatever other substrates advanced civilizations use. So, like this posture of being super confident that it needs to be carbon-based organic atoms. Like, oh, what if it turns out that we are not even implemented on those? It seems like in that kind of context, it makes sense to be a bit more agnostic, perhaps.
Yeah, I would agree, because silicon and organic matter is part of this presumably simulated reality. So we don't know what is behind the curtain, right? So from that point of view, all matter is the same, right? It's just different. One is silicon, one is carbon, so it's not that different from that point of view.
Yeah. And I mean, and you can sort of, I guess another angle you could maybe get towards it is from a more moral perspective, where if you imagine you had some entity that was very human-like, looked like a human, talked like a human, had a life like a human, lived in society, maybe they have a silicon brain, but like maybe you didn't notice any difference until just now they had an X-ray and it turns out they like have a chip inside instead of like a cortex. It would seem very, I mean, we're looking at it from a moral point of view, just like a gut level, like it would seem really weird to say, well, now we can carve them up and take all their possessions and they have no conscious experiences. And so like that would seem to be a pretty horrible thing to do to your neighbor just because like they happen to have had an X-ray and like there was a silicon chip. Like they would still have the same memories and like the same expectations of what you should do to them, and they'd done nice things for you. So if you have the moral view that having subjective experiences is necessary for having moral status, like as it happens, I reject that moral view, but many people have that view, then you might also get this moral argument perhaps for assigning conscious experiences to silicon systems, because you could imagine this case where somebody has only a silicon brain and where there would be a very strong moral intuition that we should still assign them moral status and treat them well.
Yeah, this gradual removing of organic matter and replacing it with silicon, I think it's a good argument, but would you agree that it presupposes that consciousness is something that can be on or off and not gradual? So, for example, an ant could be conscious, but in a very low
I think
level.
I think consciousness is much more a matter of degree, and in fact, there might be many different dimensions of degrees of consciousness than we naively tend to think. If people don't reflect on it much, they might think, well, either you are conscious or you're not conscious. It's like an all or nothing thing.
Mm.
But I think if you look closely, and there are different ways. So either you could approach this like through neuroscience, and you realize there are these weird conditions, and like you study like sometimes the blind side, right, where people claim they can't see anything, but then still it looks like when they're asked to make a choice, it's actually influenced by the things they claim they couldn't see. They're all kind of weird limbo cases. Or
intoxication.
Or intoxication, various forms of drugs or altered states, like I think where it kind of gets let. But even just subjectively, I think like people who like develop skill at meditation, for example, can often realize that there's a lot more than sort of a binary yes or no to whether you're conscious of something. Like you realize maybe that your normal conscious perception actually has like it's not like if like the whole world around you is always present in your conscious experience with perfect detail, but that what you think you see, you're actually not aware of most of the time. And what little aspect of some object you're looking at kind of fluctuates in and out of experience and oscillates. And they're all kind of weird. So I do definitely think that like the more closely you look at conscious experience, the less it seems like a kind of simple on-off entity and a much more multidimensional and vague construct.
So you would say it's possible in your argument that you said like we are replacing my neurons with silicon, that I would gradually could lose consciousness, but it would be so incremental and so like small changes that we wouldn't notice from one neuron to another. But slowly, gradually, I would lose consciousness.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, but whether you did it in small steps or a big step, in neither case would you report any difference, though. I think that's the key thing. So the subject to whom this procedure was done, whether slowly or rapidly, would insist that to them things felt exactly like they did before.
Mm.
And we know that they would say that because by definition, like their verbal output is driven by various structures of their brains. The same input-output relations operate as it did at the beginning, thus at the end. Like functionally, there's no difference. And so, I mean, it's your brain that this is being done to. You're awake during the whole procedure or talking to me and reporting, and you're like, no, it's like I still see red just as much as before. It makes absolutely no difference to me. I can describe the exact ways in which the tomato is red and what it reminds me of, etc. And it seems like intuitively plausible at that point that we would like maybe defer to this subject who is like first person reporting on their experiences and confidently asserting that there has been no change.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. I think also there are more indirect ways, which is in terms of the overall coherent conceptual framework for these things. So a computationalist perspective, I think, makes a lot of sense. People who claim that like conscious experiences are more metaphysically distinct, but like face all kinds of problems of, for example, explaining how you could know that you had these experiences in the first place. If like, how do they actually affect what when you're claiming that you have some non-physicalist experiences? Like, even if you had those, like, what is the causal mechanism that connects you having those to your tongue reporting that you have them, or like you're writing a philosophical paper? Like, all of your actual output seems to be fully explainable through like what the computationalist perspective postulates, and these other things seem kind of epiphenomenal and unnecessary postulates, and mysterious. And so I think for me, it's probably actually more those kinds of considerations rather than these specific thought experiments that actually explain why I find computationalism plausible.
Yeah, so I want to be respectful of your time, so we are we ran out of time. It was a pleasure.
It always happens at the end.
Yeah, that's true. So if you're ever in Slovenia, I would I think you have a lot of fans here, so please let us know and we can organize something live, something.
Yeah, it could be fun.
Good in person.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to talk to you. Bye bye.